She made a silent signal to alert the Korean Mafia boss. And the very next moment, everything changed. The amber light of the crystal chandeliers fractured against the silver trays of the Kyros estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floors. Nyelle Carter adjusted her lace headband for the 10th time that night, her movements precise after years of service. 28 years old, a degree in strategic intelligence gathering dust, and a modest maid's uniform that had become her camouflage. This wasn't the life she'd planned. She was meant to be analyzing global threats, not polishing champagne flutes for people who didn't see her. "The guest at the head table is looking for more wine," whispered a fellow server, hurrying past. "And he's been watching you all night. It's either a compliment or a threat, and I can't tell which." Nyelle glanced toward the head of the table and felt her pulse quicken. Kyros sat there, impeccably dressed in a white dress shirt, a chest tattoo peeking through his open collar. He had been a regular at these private events for months, always controlled, always observant. But today was different. Today, he was surrounded by 4 men who moved like predators, their eyes scanning the room with a lethal focus. "Nyelle, seriously, he's still staring," her colleague hissed. "Do you know him?" "He's just a guest," Nyelle replied, grabbing a fresh bottle. But her heart hammered against her ribs. Jasmine was right, he was assessing her. Approaching the table, she felt the weight of 5 sets of eyes tracking her every move. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her professional mask firmly in place. "May I offer another pour?" Kyros met her eyes directly, his gaze calculating. He was waiting for a sign, and Nyelle was the only one who had seen the glint of a scope in the darkened balcony behind him. The silver tray was more than a tool, it was a mirror. For 7 years, Nyelle Carter had used its polished surface to watch the world behind her. At 28, she had mastered the art of being part of the furniture, a shadow in a starch-white apron who existed only to refill glasses and vanish before the thank you could be uttered. Growing up in the foster system of South Seattle, Nyelle had learned early that survival wasn't about being the loudest person in the room, it was about being the one who noticed the shift in a person's breathing before they swung a fist. She had carried that hypervigilance into the world of elite service. While the other maids at Pristine Professionals complained about the long hours and the billionaires' egos, Nyelle studied. She studied the way a husband's hand tightened on his wife's elbow just a fraction too hard when she laughed. She noticed when a high-powered CEO's eyes darted toward his briefcase whenever a particular associate entered the room. She learned the scent of adrenaline, sharp and metallic, that clung to men who were about to do something they couldn't undo. There was a specific rhythm to a high-stakes dinner, a choreography of wealth and power that Nyelle understood better than the guests themselves. She knew that the man at the end of the table with the twitching eyelid was lying about his quarterly earnings. She knew the woman in the emerald silk was carrying a burner phone in her clutch. To them, Nyelle was just a pair of hands, a dark-skinned girl who was as interchangeable as the linens. That invisibility was her greatest weapon. It allowed her to stand 3 feet away from a conspiracy and hear every whispered word. It taught her that the most dangerous people weren't the ones screaming, they were the ones like Kyros, the ones who sat perfectly still, radiating a cold, magnetic authority that felt like the eye of a hurricane. She remembered a night, 2 years prior, serving a group of offshore developers. One man had reached for her, a drunken sneer on his face, but Nyelle had shifted 6 inches to the left before his hand even moved. She had seen the muscle in his shoulder bunch, the intent forming in his clouded eyes. She hadn't looked at him, hadn't acknowledged the insult. She simply placed his water glass down and moved on. "You see everything, don't you?" an older maid had once asked her in the pantry. Nyelle had just offered a small, tight smile. She didn't just see. She catalogued. She filed away the darkness she saw in people, building a mental library of human malice and desperation. She told herself it was just a way to stay safe, a way to ensure she was never caught off guard again. She didn't realize she was training for a moment that would require her to step out of the shadows and into the line of fire. She was an expert in the language of the unspoken, waiting for a conversation that finally mattered. The transition from silence to violence was instantaneous, yet Nyelle experienced it in slow motion. The moment she pressed her finger to her temple, Kyros didn't look toward the balcony, he looked directly at her. In that split second, a silent understanding passed between the elite maid and the underworld king. He saw the truth in her eyes before his brain could process the threat. Then, the world exploded into motion. Kyros' lead enforcer didn't even look back. He lunged across the table, his heavy frame shielding the boss, while the other three men in suits drew suppressed weapons with a mechanical synchronization that defied human reflex. One diner in the background screamed as a glass shattered, not from a bullet, but from the force of an enforcer kicking a table over to create a barricade. Secure the perimeter. East balcony, now, the lead enforcer barked. Through the chaos, Kyros remained the only person who looked calm. He sat behind the overturned mahogany table, his white shirt stark against the shadows, his eyes never leaving Nyelle. She remained frozen, her hand still hovering near her temple, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply watched the balcony where a shadow was already retreating, intercepted by the silent efficiency of the men she had alerted. The room was cleared of civilians within minutes, leaving only the scent of spilled wine and the heavy, metallic tang of cold ozone. The enforcers returned, one of them nodding curtly to Kyros. Target suppressed. He was alone. Kyros stood, smoothing the front of his shirt. He stepped over the debris, his gait measured and predatory, until he stood inches from Nyelle. Up close, he was a mountain of controlled intensity. The chest tattoo peeking through his collar seemed to pulse with his breathing. "You," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that felt like a physical weight. Nyelle forced herself to maintain eye contact. "Sir." "The signal," Kyros said, his dark eyes searching hers, looking for the crack in her composure that never came. "That wasn't a guess. You didn't just see a flash of light. You knew exactly where he was and what he was holding. Who are you?" "I'm the maid, Mr. Kyros," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "I'm the one people forget is in the room." Kyros tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, one that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "People are fools. A maid sees the dust, but you saw a ghost in a rafters. My men, trained by the best, missed him. You didn't." He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing her. "Tell me, Nyelle Carter, how does a girl in a lace headband learn to read an assassin's intent?" "By watching men like you," she whispered. The following evening, the silence of the staff dormitory felt heavier than usual. Nyelle sat on the edge of her narrow twin bed, her hands folded in her lap, the modest dark maid's uniform replaced by a simple cotton sweater. She was waiting. She didn't know why, but her instincts, the ones that had saved a man's life 48 hours ago, told her the night wasn't over. When the knock came, it wasn't the frantic rapping of a coworker or the heavy thud of the estate manager. It was two precise, rhythmic taps. Nyelle opened the door to find Kyros standing in the dim hallway. He looked out of place against the peeling wallpaper and the scent of industrial floor wax. He was dressed in a black silk shirt, the open collar revealing the edge of the intricate ink that mapped his chest, and his eyes were as unreadable as obsidian. Behind him, the hallway was empty, he had left his enforcers in the shadows. "Your quarters are small for someone with such a large perspective," Kyros said, his voice a low vibration in the cramped room. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside and scanning the stacks of books on Nyelle's nightstand, titles on game theory, psychology, and tactical history. They suit my needs, Mr. Kyros, Nyelle replied, closing the door. I'm sure you didn't come here to critique my living arrangements. Kyros turned to face her, his presence domesticating the small space until she felt the walls closing in. I've spent the day reviewing the footage. My security team has a combined 60 years of experience in counterterrorism. They saw a quiet gala. You saw a trajectory. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across her bed. I don't believe in coincidences, and I don't believe in waste. You are being wasted, Nyelle. I have a job, she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. You have a disguise, he countered. You use this uniform to disappear, but we both know you're the most present person in every room you enter. I'm building something. Not just the business my father left me, but something legitimate. A foundation for community crisis intervention, designed to fix the things the city ignores. It needs someone who can see the cracks before the glass breaks. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, matte black business card. It didn't have a company name, only a phone number and a single embossed emblem. I'm offering you a seat at a different kind of table, Kyros said, his gaze locking onto hers with intense concentration. No more trays. No more invisibility. You would be my emissary. You would run the center, act as my eyes in the streets, and advise me on the darkest intentions you've spent your life studying. Nyelle looked at the card, then at the man whose life she had saved. And what happens if I say no? Then you go back to being a ghost, Kyros said softly, moving toward the door. But we both know that after what you saw, and what I saw in you, that ghost is already dead. The matte black card felt unnervingly heavy in Nyelle's pocket, a physical anchor pulling her toward a world she had spent her life observing from the safety of the periphery. She sought out Marcus at a dimly lit jazz bar in the Central District, the only person who knew the city's underbelly as well as she knew its high society parlors. Marcus was more than a friend, he was a survivor who had traded his own years of service for a quiet life behind a bar, his knuckles scarred from lessons Nyelle hoped she'd never have to learn. When she slid the card across the scarred mahogany counter, Marcus didn't pick it up. He stared at the embossed emblem as if it were a venomous spider. Kyros, he whispered, the name rattling like a dry bone. Nyelle, tell me you found this on the floor. Tell me you didn't look that man in the eye. I saved his life, Marcus. And now he's offering me one. A real one. He wants me to run a crisis center, something legitimate. Marcus finally looked up, his expression devoid of the usual warmth. The neon beer sign behind him cast a harsh, clinical blue light over his features. There is no legitimate with men like Kyros. There is only the front and the back. He's offering you a seat at his table because you're a tactical asset he doesn't have to train. You're a miracle that fell into his lap, and men like him don't believe in miracles, they believe in ownership. Nyelle straightened her back, the old habit of the invisible maid momentarily forgotten. He saw me, Marcus. Not the uniform. Not the tray. He saw what I can actually do. That's the trap, Marcus hissed, leaning over the bar, his voice dropping to a low, urgent vibration. He feeds your hunger for purpose so he can tie you to his shadow. You think you're helping the community? You'll be the face he puts on his laundry. And when the rival families come for him, and they will, Nyelle, they won't care that you're just the director of a center. They'll see a target. He reached out, covering her hand with his. His skin was rough, a stark contrast to the silk-soft world Kyros inhabited. Listen to me. Mafia debts are never paid in cash, Nyelle. They are paid in blood. Sometimes it's yours, and sometimes it's the blood of the people you're trying to save. If you walk through that door, you don't get to walk back out when the job gets dirty. Nyelle looked down at the black card. It represented a life of meaning, of power, of finally being the one who called the shots. But as she felt the weight of Marcus's fear, she realized that the invisible girl had never been in more danger than she was now, standing in the light of an offer she couldn't afford to take, and couldn't find the strength to refuse. The transition happened not with a bang, but with the rasp of a heavy zipper. Standing in the mirrored dressing room of a private boutique Kyros had closed for the afternoon, Nyelle shed the polyester maid's uniform like a dead skin. In its place, she donned a charcoal wool suit, tailored so precisely it felt less like clothing and more like a second skeleton. The fabric was expensive, silent, and sharp, the kind of armor that didn't stop bullets, but ensured you were the person who decided if they were ever fired. When she stepped out, Kyros was waiting, leaning against a display case with his usual air of predatory stillness. He didn't offer a compliment, he offered a critique. "The suit tells them you belong in the room," he said, his eyes tracking the way she moved. "But your eyes still look like you're waiting for someone to ask for more coffee. Stop looking for permission, Nyelle. An emissary doesn't ask. They announce." The training that followed was a masterclass in the unspoken. Over the next 2 weeks, Kyros moved her through the city like a piece on a chessboard. He didn't take her to back alleys or smoke-filled basements, he took her to high-rise boardrooms and silent art galleries where millions of dollars changed hands with a single nod. Syndicate diplomacy is about the "no" that sounds like a "yes," Kyros explained one evening over a map of the city's shipping districts. Everyone wants something. A rival wants territory. A politician wants a clean record. Your job is to find what they fear losing most and stand in front of it. Nyelle practiced the art of the Kyros stare, a neutral, unwavering gaze that forced the other person to fill the silence with their own nervous mistakes. She learned that power wasn't just about the enforcer standing 10 feet behind her, it was about the information she held in her mind. She began to catalog the dark intentions of the city's elite with a new level of precision. No longer was she just watching the husband's hand on an elbow, she was calculating how that aggression could be used as leverage in a contract negotiation. By the end of the second week, the hypervigilance that had once been her survival mechanism had evolved into a weaponized intuition. She could walk into a room and instantly identify who was the threat, who was the coward, and who was the one holding the keys. As they sat in the back of his darkened sedan one rainy Tuesday, Kyros watched her review a dossier on a local councilman. "You're a fast learner," he remarked, the orange glow of a street lamp passing over his tattooed throat. "I spent years being invisible, Mr. Kyros," Nyelle replied, not looking up from the files. "You'd be surprised how much you learn when people think you can't hear them." "I think," he said softly, "nothing about you would surprise me anymore." The air inside the emerald vault was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the electric hum of desperation. It was a playground for the city's elite, where fortunes were bled dry under the glow of neon chandeliers. Nyelle walked at Han's side, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. She wore a backless gown of midnight silk that clung to her like a shadow, the fabric a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. For the first time, she wasn't the invisible girl in the corner, she was the center of the room's gravity. "Stay close," Han murmured, his voice barely audible over the clatter of roulette chips. "The mole is watching the high-limit baccarat table. He thinks we're here to celebrate a merger. Give him a reason to believe the distraction." Nyelle leaned in, her hair brushing against his shoulder. The proximity was intoxicating, a dangerous blend of tactical necessity and genuine heat. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath the fine wool of his tuxedo, a reminder that for all his cold calculation, he was undeniably human. "I've spent years pretending to be less than I am, Han," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. "Pretending to be in love with a man like you isn't the hardest part of the job." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with the mission. For a heartbeat, the casino faded away. There was no mole, no syndicate, no looming threat, only the friction of two people who had spent their lives in the dark finally finding a match. "Then don't pretend," he said softly. They reached the table, and Nyelle shifted into the role of the devoted partner, her laughter light and melodic as she watched the cards. But her eyes remained sharp, scanning the periphery as she had been trained. She noticed a dealer whose hands trembled slightly when Han placed $1 million bet, and a floor manager whose gaze lingered too long on Han's drink. "The manager," she breathed, leaning toward Han's ear as if sharing a secret. "Table position 4. He's transmitting on a localized frequency." Han didn't flinch. He simply reached out and covered her hand with his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. The touch sent a jolt through her, a grounding force in the sea of chaos. "Good eyes, Emissary," he whispered. As the trap closed around the traitor, the line between their professional alliance and something deeper began to blur. Nyelle realized that she was no longer just his eyes in the room, she was becoming the only person he allowed to see the man behind the tattoo. The dance was no longer just with danger, it was with a future she had never dared to imagine. The transition from the velvet luxury of the casino to the damp, concrete reality of the waterfront was like a cold douse of water. Following the successful exposure of the mole, the romantic haze that had softened the edges of Nyelle's world evaporated as Han led her into a secluded warehouse on Pier 19. The air here didn't smell of expensive cologne or champagne, it smelled of salt, rust, and the sharp, copper tang of fear. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single, swinging industrial light, sat the floor manager from the casino. He was zip-tied to a metal chair, his face a map of bruises. Han's enforcers stood in the shadows, their silence more terrifying than any shouting. Han didn't look like the man who had whispered, "Don't pretend," an hour ago. His expression was flat, his eyes drained of warmth as he stood over the traitor. "You weren't just selling information," Han said, his voice a low, terrifying crawl. "You were selling the location of the safe house for the women we relocated from the docks. You put lives at risk for a payout from the Kim family." Nyelle stood by the door, her midnight silk dress feeling absurdly fragile in this brutal space. She watched as Han reached out, not to strike the man, but to place a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was intimate and horrifying. Han leaned in, whispering something into the man's ear that made his entire body go limp with terror. Then, Han signaled to his lead enforcer, a sharp, dismissive jerk of the chin. "Take him to the basement," Han commanded. "And make sure he understands that in my organization, some debts can only be settled in pieces." As the man was dragged away, his pleas echoing off the corrugated metal walls, Han turned back to Nyelle. He saw the look in her eyes, the flicker of the invisible girl, who wanted to run back to her coffee shop and her student loans. He walked toward her, the light and shadow playing across his chest tattoo. "This is the ledger, Nyelle," he said, stopping just outside her personal space. "To build the crisis center, to protect the neighborhood, I have to be the monster that keeps the other monsters away. You wanted to do work that mattered. This is what it costs to keep the peace." Nyelle looked at the hand that had traced her knuckles earlier, now clenched into a fist. She realized that Han wasn't a hero in a charcoal suit, he was a man walking a razor's edge between salvation and damnation. The question wasn't whether she could change him, but whether she could live with the version of himself he used to protect her dream. The dark side wasn't a secret he was keeping from her, it was the foundation of everything he had offered her. She had spent her life reading people's intentions, but as she looked at Han, she couldn't tell where the protector ended and the predator began. If she stayed, she was no longer just an emissary of his business, she was an accomplice to his soul. She had to decide if the lives they would save at the center were worth the blood spilled in the warehouse. The grand opening of the Kyros Community Center was supposed to be the bridge to a new life, a night where the scent of fresh paint and hope drowned out the lingering salt and copper of the warehouse. But as Nyelle stood on the glass mezzanine, Looking down at the crowd of local leaders and undercover enforcers, the air shifted. It was a familiar sensation, the sudden drop in barometric pressure that preceded a storm. She saw it before anyone else. It wasn't a weapon, it was a lapse in the choreography. The two enforcers guarding the service entrance didn't look toward the kitchen, they looked toward the exit, their postures sagging in a way that suggested they weren't tired, but compromised. "Han," Nyelle whispered, pulling him into the shadow of a decorative pillar. "Your men at the north door. They aren't watching the room. They're watching the clock." Before Han could respond, the lights flickered and died. In the sudden vacuum of darkness, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy canisters hitting the floor. Tear gas. Pandemonium erupted as the civilian guests scrambled for the exits, but Nyelle felt Han's hand grip her waist, pulling her toward the emergency stairwell. "Ambush," Han hissed, his voice tight with a rare flicker of alarm. He reached for his radio, but only static barked back. "Comms are jammed. My inner circle, they wouldn't have missed this. Unless they helped." They burst into the secondary security hub, only to find the monitors smashed and Han's most trusted guards unconscious, not dead, but expertly neutralized with tranquilizers. The rival faction didn't want a massacre, they wanted a kidnapping. They wanted the kingpin alive to sign away his territory. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy, disciplined, and fast. "There's no way out through the lobby," Nyelle said, her mind spinning through the blueprints she had memorized during construction. "And the service elevator is trapped." She looked at the janitorial closet tucked behind the server rack. To anyone else, it was a dead end. To the girl who had spent a lifetime disappearing in plain sight, it was a tactical advantage. "They're looking for a mafia boss and his emissary," Nyelle whispered, her eyes locking onto Han's in the dark. "They aren't looking for the help." She grabbed two discarded maintenance jumpsuits from the floor. "If we fight, we die here. But they're clearing the building room by room, following the heat signatures of your guards. We're going to walk right past them." As the heavy doors to the hub were kicked open, Nyelle didn't flinch. She grabbed a mop bucket and a rolling cart, shoving a jumpsuit at Han. In the strobe-like flickers of the emergency lights, they became ghosts again, two low-status workers cleaning up the mess of a high-status war. It was the ultimate irony. The very invisibility Nyelle had hated was now the only thing keeping the most powerful man in Seattle breathing. The damp morning air tasted of salt and resolution as the sun climbed over the Seattle skyline, illuminating the broken glass of the community center's lobby. The coup had been swift, but the reclamation was swifter. Using the back-channel connections Nyelle had cultivated as an emissary and the tactical invisibility she had mastered as a maid, they had turned the tide. While the rival faction hunted a kingpin, Nyelle had reached out to the neighborhood's silent observers, the delivery drivers, the janitors, the street-side vendors, orchestrating a counter-move that trapped the usurpers in a web of their own making. Han stood on the rooftop of the center, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal the full complexity of the ink on his forearms. He wasn't looking at the city as a kingdom to be ruled, but as a map to be mended. The situation had been handled, and while there were scars, the center remained standing. Nyelle walked up behind him, her movements no longer hesitant or subservient. She wore the charcoal suit she had called her armor, but it no longer felt like a costume. It was her skin. She had saved his life twice, once with a signal and once with a mop bucket, and in doing so, she had bridged the gap between his world and her own. "The police are taking the statements," Nyelle said, standing beside him. "The neighborhood is talking. They aren't talking about a mafia hit. They're talking about the staff who protected the building when the lights went out. You're becoming a hero, Han. It's a dangerous look for a man in your position." Han turned to her, the morning light catching the gold in his eyes. The predator was still there, but he was restrained, guided by a new logic. I'm not the hero of this story, Nyelle. I'm just the man who was smart enough to hire the woman who saw the scope. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he interlaced his fingers with hers. The touch was no longer part of a dance with danger, or a tactical ruse. It was an anchor. The old way ended last night, Han continued, looking back at the horizon. The debt is paid. From today, the Kyros syndicate doesn't just take. It builds. But I can't navigate the legitimacy alone. I need someone who knows how to see the ghosts before they materialize. Nyelle looked down at their joined hands. She had started this journey as a girl trying to pay off student loans, a ghost in a lace headband. Now, she was the architect of something that would outlive them both. She wasn't his maid, his server, or even just his emissary. She was his equal, the silent protector who had stepped into the light to lead. We have a lot of work to do, Nyelle said, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. Then let's get started, Han replied. They stood together as the city woke up, two survivors who had traded their shadows for a seat at the head of a new, legitimate empire. The era of the silent signal was over, the era of the new order had begun. Nyelle saved his life with a single finger to her temple, but can she save his soul without losing her own? The new order has begun, but in a world of blood and silk, nothing is ever truly legitimate. Which side would you choose, the safety of the shadows or the danger of the throne? Let me know in the comments if you think Nyelle and Han can truly escape their pasts.